burned to imperial palaces, thrown into Dachau. His royal blood made him the ultimate target for Hitler's revenge, but the Nazis didn't want him dead. A bullet would create a martyr. They wanted him systematically broken. March 12, 1938, the Anschluss. As German forces crossed the border, the Gestapo activated a pre-written hit list. Ernst and his brother Maximilian were arrested within 96 hours. No trial, no hearings, just protective custody. Stripped of their titles, their clothes, and their rights, they were loaded onto the first transport to Germany. Destination: Dachau. In 1938, Dachau wasn't a death camp yet. It was a laboratory for terror, built to dismantle human identity. When the Hohenberg brothers arrived, the SS saw an opportunity to humiliate the living symbols of the Habsburg Empire. They designed a custom curriculum of degradation. The brothers' assignment: the Cloaken Commando, the latrine detail. The latrine block was an open concrete trench inside a suffocating wooden barrack. No privacy. Hundreds of starving men, ravaged by dysentery and typhus, perched side by side over overflowing pits of infectious human waste. The stench was a physical wall of ammonia and rot, an absolute biological hazard. This was the domain assigned to the son of an archduke. The humiliation was orchestrated in calculated stages. According to the detailed historical records and testimonies gathered by historians, the SS guards initially handed the royal brothers small silver teaspoons. They were ordered to clean the vast encrusted concrete rims of the latrine pits, using only these absurdly inadequate instruments. It was a task engineered for failure and despair. Ernst was forced to kneel at the edge of the pit, leaning over the raw sewage, meticulously scraping away dried feces, while SS guards stood over him. The guards would smoke cigarettes, laughing and mocking the men they called the princes of shit. If Ernst paused due to the excruciating strain in his back, or if he gagged and vomited from the overwhelming stench, a natural physiological reaction, the guards would ruthlessly kick him, sometimes sending him tumbling directly into the trench of human waste. He would then be dragged out, beaten with truncheons, and ordered to resume scraping. But the spoons were merely a psychological prelude. After a few days, the camp authorities decided that even a teaspoon afforded the prisoners too much dignity. They confiscated the spoons and issued a new directive. The latrines were to be cleaned with bare hands. This escalation marked the crossing of a horrific threshold. Ernst von Hohenberg, a man who had been raised in the Hofburg Palace, was now forced to plunge his bare arms up to the elbows into the freezing, disease-riddled muck to clear blockages in the drains. He had to use rags and his own fingers to scrub the concrete floors where hundreds of sick men had lost control of their bowels. He spent 12 to 14 hours a day bent double, breathing in toxic fumes, enveloped in a profound filth that permeated his skin, his hair, and his lungs. There was virtually no soap available in Dachau, meaning Ernst was forced to eat his meager rations with the same unwashed hands that had spent the day submerged in the latrines. The physical labor extended beyond the pits themselves. When the massive concrete trenches required emptying, the waste was shoveled into a cloaken cairn, a massive heavy wooden cart. Ernst and Maximilian, along with other members of their work detail, were treated like draft animals. They were harnessed to the cart and forced to haul hundreds of pounds of sloshing human excrement across the uneven grounds of the camp. The guards delighted in forcing the princes to pull this cart past the other prisoner blocks, loudly announcing the arrival of the royal carriage. It was a spectacle of suffering, designed not just to break Ernst, but to send a chilling message to every other prisoner in Dachau. If the Nazis could reduce a Habsburg prince to a beast of burden drowning in feces, there was absolutely no hope for anyone else. Yet amid this calculated descent into hell, a remarkable dynamic emerged. The SS guards, armed with absolute power and instruments of torture, found themselves perpetually frustrated by their victims. Leopold Fiegel, a prominent Austrian politician who was also imprisoned in Dachau and witnessed the Hohenberg brothers' ordeal firsthand, later provided a crucial piece of testimony. Fiegel noted that while Ernst and Maximilian were constantly covered in filth and subjected to daily beatings, they performed their horrific duties with a quiet, unshakable stoicism. Fiegel described their demeanor as almost cheerful, not a literal expression of joy, but a profound, deliberate refusal to surrender their inner dignity to their captors. Ernst never screamed for mercy. He never begged the guards for a reprieve. He maintained an upright posture whenever he was not forced to bend over the pits. He spoke kindly to his fellow prisoners and shared what little he had. This quiet defiance infuriated the SS. The guards required their victims to break, to weep, to acknowledge their total subjugation. Ernst's refusal to mentally collapse under the weight of the latrines was a victory the Nazis could not tolerate, resulting in even more frequent and savage beatings. However, the human body can only endure so much biological and physical trauma. The spirit may remain unbroken, but flesh and bone inevitably yield to the brutal mathematics of starvation and disease. Months of intimate daily exposure to untreated human waste, combined with severe malnutrition and freezing temperatures, fundamentally destroyed Ernst von Hohenberg's health. He contracted chronic severe dysentery. The aggressive bacteria ravaged his intestinal tract, causing massive internal damage that his starved immune system was completely incapable of fighting. The repeated beatings from the guards, who routinely kicked him in the ribs and kidneys as he knelt by the latrines, caused internal hemorrhaging and organ damage. His teeth began to loosen and fall out due to a lack of basic vitamins. His heart muscle weakened under the relentless strain of the forced labor. The strong patrician man who had walked into Dachau in the spring of 1938 was rapidly deteriorating into a hollowed-out shell, his body literally rotting from the inside out due to the specific conditions of his punishment. Though Ernst was eventually transferred from Dachau to other camps, including Buchenwald, and miraculously secured a release into heavily monitored house arrest in 1943, he never truly escaped the latrines. The freedom he experienced was a cruel illusion, granted only to a body that had already been mortally wounded. Following the collapse of the Third Reich and the end of the Second World War, Ernst attempted to rebuild a semblance of his life in a shattered Austria. But the poison of Dachau was permanent. He spent the post-war years trapped in a cycle of severe chronic pain, battling the lasting intestinal and cardiac damage inflicted by his time in the Cloaken Commando. His life became a slow, agonizing continuation of the physical destruction that began with a bare-handed scrub of a concrete pit. When Ernst von Hohenberg died in 1954, at the painfully young age of 49, the medical cause was listed as heart failure. But the undeniable historical truth is that his death was the final, delayed result of an execution orchestrated through unimaginable filth and humiliation. This physical degradation was paired with a profound psychological isolation. Despite being connected by blood to almost every major royal house in Europe, The brothers' arrest triggered practically no international outcry. The great powers, locked in the politics of appeasement, remained silent. Ernst was entirely abandoned by his social class. The SS guards weaponized this reality. They taunted the brothers with news of Europe's indifference, making it clear that their royal blood meant absolutely nothing outside the barbed wire. This psychological warfare was compounded by the deliberate cruelty of keeping the two brothers together. In many ways, having a sibling in a concentration camp was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided crucial emotional support to one another. On the other, the SS used their bond as an instrument of torture. If Ernst paused in his horrific labor at the latrines, the guards would not just beat him, they would brutally beat Maximilian while Ernst was forced to watch, helpless. The Nazis understood that for a man of honor, watching a loved one suffer because of his own perceived failure is far worse than enduring personal pain. The brothers were forced into a terrible silent pact of mutual endurance. They had to suppress their own agony, swallow their pride, and keep scraping the concrete pits, not just to save themselves, but to protect each other from the capricious wrath of the young men in black uniforms. These guards were a crucial element of the terror. The SS men assigned to Dachau in 1938 were not the hardened veterans of the later war years. Many were incredibly young, barely out of the Hitler Youth. They were boys in their late teens and early 20s who had been thoroughly indoctrinated with a virulent hatred for the old aristocratic order. Ernst von Hohenberg was in his early 30s, a grown man who carried the physical bearing of an empire that these young guards had been taught to despise. The generational power dynamic was entirely inverted. Teenage guards with absolute authority and submachine guns held the power of life and death over a man who, under different circumstances, would have been their sovereign. They channeled their indoctrinated resentments into their daily interactions with the princes. They did not just demand obedience. They demanded active, performative subjugation. They forced Ernst to address them with exaggerated respect while his hands were submerged in human waste. They made him sing Nazi marching songs while he hauled the massive wooden carts of excrement across the compound. As the spring and summer of 1938 gave way to autumn, a new terrifying element was introduced to the daily routine: the Bavarian cold. Dachau is located near Munich, and the winters there are notoriously bitter. The prisoners were not issued proper winter clothing. They wore the same thin blue and white striped canvas uniforms year-round, supplemented only by whatever miserable rags they could scrounge or steal. The daily schedule at the camp was built around the appell, the roll call. Twice a day at dawn and dusk, the entire camp population was forced to stand at rigid attention on the massive concrete parade ground. These roll calls could last for hours. If a prisoner was missing, or if the camp commandant simply felt vindictive, the men would stand in the freezing rain, sleet, or snow until someone collapsed. For Ernst and the men of the latrine detail, the cold brought a specific localized horror. The open concrete pits of the latrines did not have heating. As the temperatures dropped below freezing, the liquid waste began to freeze solid. The unbearable stench of the summer was replaced by a brutal physical impossibility. The guards still demanded that the pits be cleaned, but now the prisoners had to chip away at frozen blocks of human excrement with their bare, freezing hands, or with whatever crude makeshift scrapers they were allowed to possess. Frostbite became rampant. Ernst's hands, already raw, infected, and blistered from the acidic nature of the waste and the lack of soap, began to crack and bleed openly into the freezing muck. Every movement became a fresh agony. The cold also accelerated the starvation process. A human body performing heavy manual labor in sub-zero temperatures burns thousands of calories just to maintain its core temperature. Ernst was surviving on perhaps 600 to 800 calories a day of watery, nutrient-void soup. His body began to cannibalize its own muscle tissue to keep his vital organs functioning. The broad-shouldered prince was shrinking, his cheekbones jutting out, his eyes sinking deep into his skull. Yet the bizarre paradox of Dachau was that amidst this total physical collapse, the camp operated with a terrifying bureaucratic precision. The SS documented everything. They kept meticulous medical records of the very diseases they were intentionally causing. They recorded Ernst's weight loss, his bouts of dysentery, his physical decline, treating him less like a human being and more like a subject in a grim biological experiment. He was forced to march in perfect unison with the other prisoners. His barracks had to be flawlessly clean, his straw mattress perfectly aligned, even though he spent his days wallowing in filth. This forced adherence to meaningless order while surrounded by chaotic cruelty was designed to snap the minds of the inmates. It was a world entirely devoid of logic, where a speck of dust on a uniform could result in a lethal beating, while the man delivering the beating was actively forcing his victims to eat with feces-stained hands. Through it all, the memory of his father hung over Ernst like a heavy shroud. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had died quickly, taken by an assassin's bullet on a sunny day in Sarajevo. He had died as an heir to an empire, surrounded by aides and the shock of a nation. His son was dying slowly, inches at a time, in the freezing mud of a Bavarian prison camp, surrounded by the moans of dying men and the laughter of teenage guards. Hitler's revenge was not just about punishing the individual. It was about rewriting the narrative of power. By breaking Ernst von Hohenberg so completely, so intimately, and so methodically, the Third Reich was declaring that the old world was dead and that the new order would be built on a foundation of absolute, unrestrained brutality. The SS administration utilized Dachau not merely as a prison, but as a central academy for terror. Young recruits, many drawn from rural Bavarian farms or the disaffected urban youth, were brought to the camp to be systematically stripped of their empathy. The prisoner population served as the raw material for this dark pedagogy, and having the sons of Archduke Franz Ferdinand within the wire was considered an extraordinary training tool. The camp commandants used Ernst and Maximilian von Hohenberg to demonstrate a core tenet of Nazi ideology to the junior guards. Absolute power recognizes no prior authority. By encouraging teenage recruits to beat, spit upon, and degrade men who had once walked the halls of the Habsburg Palace, the SS forged a new generation of enforcers utterly detached from traditional morality. The latrine detail, therefore, functioned as the ultimate classroom. When a young guard forced Ernst to his knees in the freezing filth, he was not just punishing a prisoner, he was actively participating in the ideological slaughter of the old European order. The mechanics of this daily degradation were centered around the Cloak and Karen, the massive waste wagon. This vehicle was a crude, heavy wooden cart designed to hold hundreds of gallons of liquid excrement. It was entirely devoid of modern engineering, lacking proper suspension or manageable steering, making it monstrously difficult to maneuver. Ernst, Maximilian, and a handful of other specifically targeted political prisoners were treated as human draft animals. They were forced into heavy rope harnesses that cut deeply into their emaciated shoulders and collarbones. Every day, they had to drag this sloshing, overflowing cart across the uneven, often muddy or frozen terrain of the camp. The physical physics of the task were designed to break the human spine. If the cart hit a rut and tipped, a frequent occurrence, the freezing, diseased contents would spill over the prisoners. The guards would immediately descend upon them with truncheons, beating them savagely while ordering them to scoop the waste back into the cart, using only their hands or small tin bowls. The physical toll of this labor intersected lethally with the realities of camp starvation. The human body requires immense caloric intake to perform heavy manual labor, especially in sub-zero winter temperatures. Ernst was burning thousands of calories, hauling the waste wagon and shivering on the roll call square, yet he was provided with only a few hundred calories a day in the form of watered-down turnip soup and bread mixed with sawdust. His body, desperate for fuel, began to cannibalize its own muscle tissue and fat reserves. The chronic dysentery he contracted from the latrines meant his intestines were essentially shredded. Whatever meager nutrients he swallowed passed through him unabsorbed, accompanied by agonizing cramps and blood loss. His gums receded rapidly due to severe vitamin deficiency, causing his teeth to loosen and fall out. The guards observed this biological collapse with clinical detachment, recording his declining weight and frequent collapses in the camp ledgers as proof that their methods were working. They were orchestrating the deliberate biological dismantling of a human being. This physical destruction was sharpened by the extreme psychological dissonance of Ernst's existence. He had spent his formative years in the Belvedere Palace and Archstetten Castle. His sensory memory was built on the precise protocols of the imperial court, the scent of expensive oils, the texture of heavy silk, and the quiet dignity of aristocratic life. Now his entire sensory universe had collapsed into the sharp chemical sting of chloride of lime, the suffocating reek of mass human waste, and the abrasive friction of frozen mud against raw skin. The SS aggressively exploited this mental contrast. They weaponized his identity against him, frequently addressing him by his defunct royal titles with dripping sarcasm. A guard would strike him across the face with a riding crop and order, "Your Highness, the trench requires your attention." It was a form of psychological vivisection, designed to make his own memories a source of agonizing torture rather than comfort. Despite these exhaustive efforts to isolate and break them, a profound silent solidarity emerged among the political prisoners, and Ernst played a pivotal role in it. Men like Leopold Fiegel, who observed the brothers closely, noted a remarkable phenomenon. In an environment specifically engineered to turn starving men against each other, to reduce them to animals willing to kill over a scrap of bread, Ernst maintained a rigid, unyielding moral code. He refused to lash out at his fellow inmates. When he acquired an extra piece of bread, he shared it with men who were closer to death than he was. He used his remaining physical strength to help support weaker prisoners during the endless freezing roll calls, preventing them from collapsing and being subsequently murdered by the guards. This solidarity was not merely an act of kindness, it was an act of extreme political rebellion. The Nazi apparatus required the prisoners to behave like feral beasts to justify their extermination. By acting as a man of principle, even while submerged in excrement, Ernst was actively sabotaging the core psychological objective of the Dachau system. This quiet, stubborn resistance enraged the camp authorities, and the price for his defiance was extracted directly from his flesh. The SS despised nothing more than a victim who refused to mentally capitulate. Consequently, the physical beatings intensified. The guards specifically targeted Ernst's kidneys, liver, and stomach with their heavy steel-toed boots, aiming to cause permanent internal damage. They struck him across the mouth with rifle butts, accelerating the loss of his teeth and leaving his face permanently scarred. The explicit goal was to force him to crawl, to weep, to audibly beg for mercy, and admit that the old world he represented was fundamentally inferior to the new Nazi reality. But Ernst absorbed the agonizing blows in silence. He accepted the destruction of his physical body in order to protect his psychological core. It was a brutal war of attrition, fought on the suffocating battleground of the latrine trenches, pitting the infinite cruelty of a totalitarian state against the stubborn, quiet dignity of a single man. Time in Dachau did not behave according to the laws of the outside world. It was measured not in hours or days, but in increments of agony, exhaustion, and the relentless accumulation of filth. As 1938 bled into 1939, Ernst von Hohenberg remained tethered to the Cloaken Commando, the latrine detail, trapped in a seemingly infinite loop of degradation. The initial shock of plunging his royal hands into human waste had long since worn off, replaced by a dull, constant, and horrifying physical reality. The camp was expanding rapidly as Adolf Hitler's geopolitical ambitions began to consume Europe. With every new annexation, with every political purge, trains arrived at Dachau, disgorging thousands of terrified new inmates. The camp's infrastructure, rudimentary and cruel by design, buckled under the weight of the exploding population. The open concrete latrine trenches, originally designed to humiliate a smaller number of political prisoners, now became catastrophic epicenters of biological horror. The sheer volume of human waste, generated by thousands of starving, profoundly sick men, outpaced any manual effort to clear it. Ernst and his brother Maximilian found themselves fighting a literal rising tide of excrement, their 12-hour shifts stretching into the night as the SS guards demanded the impossible task of keeping the overflowing pits contained. The biological assault on Ernst's body became absolute. A concentration camp latrine is not merely a place of foul odors, it is a highly concentrated vector for lethal pathogens. The trenches teemed with the bacteria responsible for cholera, typhoid, and the ever-present ravaging dysentery. Because Ernst was forced to clean these trenches with his bare hands, and because he was denied access to clean water, soap, or sanitary rags, these microscopic killers had unimpeded access to his failing system. The human skin, under normal circumstances a formidable barrier, had been compromised. His hands and forearms were constantly covered in microabrasions from scraping the rough concrete, chemical burns from the harsh chloride of lime the guards occasionally threw into the pits, and deep agonizing fissures caused by the freezing Bavarian winter. Every cut became severely infected. His fingernails blackened and split. But the external wounds were merely the visible manifestation of a deeper destruction. The dysentery bacteria took permanent root in his intestinal tract. This disease does not simply cause discomfort, it violently strips the lining of the intestines, leading to massive fluid loss, severe internal bleeding, and a debilitating inability to absorb whatever minuscule nutrients were present in the camp's watery turnip soup. Ernst was slowly, methodically starving to death, while his internal organs were actively being digested by infection. The historical irony of his suffering was so profound it bordered on the surreal. In September 1939, the geopolitical powder keg finally detonated. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, plunging the globe into the Second World War. As the sirens wailed and the mechanized slaughter of millions began across the continent, the son of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man whose assassination in Sarajevo had triggered the First World War 25 years earlier, was kneeling in a puddle of infected urine, scraping feces off a concrete wall. The great conflict of the 20th century was roaring to life outside the barbed wire, driven by the very dictator who held Ernst captive. Yet for Ernst, the grand movements of armies and the fall of nations were entirely secondary to the immediate, desperate struggle to draw a clean breath, to ignore the blinding cramps in his abdomen, and to survive the next blow from an SS guard's truncheon. The guards themselves grew more vicious as the war escalated. The early camp personnel, who had viewed the Hohenberg brothers as political trophies to be mocked, were increasingly replaced by hardened, radicalized combat veterans or hyper-indoctrinated youth who viewed the prisoners merely as vermin to be exterminated through labor. Under this new, intensified regime, the latrine detail morphed from a theater of humiliation into a mechanism for outright biological murder. The guards recognized that Ernst's physical strength was failing. The broad-shouldered, aristocratic physique that had walked through the gates in 1938 had been carved away, leaving a skeletal figure with jutting collarbones, hollowed eyes, and a complexion tinged with the yellow pallor of liver failure. Recognizing his weakness, the SS deliberately increased the physical demands placed upon him. When the heavy wooden cloaking cairn, the waste wagon, became stuck in the freezing mud of the camp compound, the guards would forbid the other prisoners from assisting. They would force Ernst alone to heave against the hundreds of pounds of sloshing waste, striking him across the back with leather whips if the cart failed to move. If the wagon tipped, spilling raw sewage over his striped uniform he was not permitted to wash, he was forced to wear the freezing, crusting filth through the long night in the unheated barracks, a practice that guaranteed the further spread of disease and respiratory infections. This was the true nature of Adolf Hitler's vengeance. It was a masterpiece of patient, sadistic engineering. Hitler could have ordered Ernst von Hohenberg to be executed by a firing squad within an hour of his arrest in Vienna. But a bullet is fast, and a bullet confers a certain tragic dignity. A man shot against a wall dies as a martyr. A man who dies slowly, coughing up blood and shivering in his own excrement on the floor of a latrine block, dies stripped of all majesty. The Führer intended to prove that the Habsburg bloodline, the ancient dynasty that had ruled vast swathes of Europe for centuries, was biologically and spiritually inferior to the new Aryan ideal. By reducing the prince to a ragged, stinking creature whose entire existence revolved around the management of human waste, the Nazi regime was conducting a grotesque alchemy. They were attempting to transform royal gold into literal filth. They wanted Ernst to look into the dark, reflective surface of the latrine trenches and see not a prince, but an animal. Yet despite the catastrophic collapse of his physical form, the SS could not engineer the psychological surrender they so desperately craved. The absolute nadir of human suffering is often where the most stubborn remnants of identity refuse to die. Ernst von Hohenberg, his internal organs failing, his teeth falling out from scurvy and repeated blows to the face, his hands permanently stained and scarred, continued to defy the fundamental premise of his torture. He did not become the feral beast the camp system was designed to produce. He continued to speak to his brother Maximilian with quiet respect. He continued to offer a steadying hand to fellow prisoners who stumbled under the weight of the waste cart, even when doing so, earned him a savage beating. He maintained an internal fortress of dignity that the SS, with all their truncheons, dogs, and calculated humiliations, simply could not breach. His physical body belonged entirely to the horrific reality of the Dachau latrines, but his mind remained untouchable, locked away in a realm of quiet, unyielding defiance. This war of attrition between a totalitarian state and a single man's dignity dragged on for years. The seasons cycled through agonizing extremes. The suffocating fly-blown heat of the Bavarian summers, where the stench of the trenches caused men to faint dead away, and the lethal, paralyzing freeze of the winters, where the waste had to be chipped out with bare hands. Through it all, the poison of the camp was doing permanent, irreversible work. Even as political shifts and bureaucratic whims within the Nazi hierarchy eventually led to his transfer to the Buchenwald concentration camp, and miraculously to a heavily monitored release in 1943, the damage was absolute. The SS had not managed to kill his spirit, but they had definitively murdered his body. They had simply arranged for the corpse to continue walking for a few more years. The latrines of Dachau had not just stained his hands. They had fundamentally altered his cellular structure, injecting him with a slow-acting venom of disease and internal trauma that he would carry with him back out into the world, a fatal inheritance from a regime that knew exactly how to destroy a man without ever firing a gun. The release, when it finally materialized in the spring of 1943, was as surreal and bureaucratic as the initial arrest. There was no grand liberation, no sweeping justice, and no apology from the state that had stolen 5 years of his life and irreparably ruined his body. Ernst von Hohenberg was simply summoned from the brutal routine of the concentration camp, processed through the sterile, meticulous paperwork of the SS administration, and handed back the civilian clothes that had been confiscated half a decade earlier. The physical act of dressing himself was a grotesque pantomime. The finely tailored suit that had fit the robust, broad-shouldered aristocrat in 1938 now hung off a skeletal frame. The fabric draped loosely over jutting collarbones and a sunken chest, a sartorial ghost haunting the hollowed-out remnants of a man. His hands, permanently scarred, calloused and trembling from neurological damage and extreme malnutrition, struggled with the simple mechanics of buttons and shoelaces. He was permitted to walk out of the camp gates, leaving the barbed wire and the immediate threat of the guards behind. But true freedom was an absolute biological impossibility. The concentration camp had not merely imprisoned him, it had infected him, altering the very composition of his cells. He was stepping into the outside world, but he was carrying the Dachau latrines with him, buried deep within his ruined organs. His return to Vienna was an exercise in profound dislocation. He was placed under strict, heavily monitored house arrest, a prisoner in his own homeland. The Austria he returned to was entirely unrecognizable. It was no longer the vibrant, independent nation he had fiercely defended in public speeches. It was the Ostmark, a fully integrated, heavily militarized province of the Third Reich, deeply entrenched in a catastrophic global war. The streets were patrolled by the same uniforms that had tormented him in the camp. The Gestapo watched his every movement, ensuring that the former prince remained isolated and silent. But the external surveillance was almost redundant compared to the internal prison of his own failing body. The transition from the wooden bunks of the camp barracks to a proper bed offered no solace. The trauma of the camps is not something that evaporates upon contact with soft linen. Ernst suffered from severe chronic insomnia, his nervous system permanently wired for the sudden violent intrusions of the SS guards. When he did sleep, he was violently thrown back into the sensory nightmare of the Cloaken Commando. The suffocating stench of ammonia, the freezing mud, and the sharp crack of a leather whip across his back manifested in hyper-realistic night terrors that left him waking in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his frail ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. The most devastating reality of his release was the undeniable fact of his physiological destruction. Chronic dysentery is not an ailment that simply vanishes when the immediate source of infection is removed. The aggressive bacteria that had colonized his digestive tract during his months of barehanded labor in the overflowing concrete pits had caused catastrophic, irreversible damage. The delicate lining of his intestines had been essentially shredded, replaced by rigid, non-functioning scar tissue. Eating a normal meal was an agonizing ordeal. His stomach could no longer properly process complex proteins or fats. Every attempt to consume the very food his body desperately needed to rebuild itself resulted in blinding abdominal cramps, severe nausea, and a humiliating lack of bowel control. He was a man starving to death in a house with food, his digestive system having been thoroughly sabotaged by the biological warfare of the latrine trenches. Furthermore, the relentless physical abuse, the kicks to the abdomen, the blows to the kidneys with rifle butts, had left his internal organs permanently inflamed and misaligned. His liver function was severely compromised, casting a sickly, yellowish pallor over his hollowed cheeks. This internal ruin was paired with an external degradation that was impossible to hide. The severe scurvy and extreme vitamin deficiencies suffered in Dachau, compounded by the guards' penchant for striking prisoners in the face, had resulted in the catastrophic loss of his teeth. For a man born into the highest echelons of European royalty, a man whose public image and diplomatic presence were once paramount, this physical disfigurement was a source of profound quiet humiliation. Chewing was nearly impossible, forcing him to subsist on soft, easily digestible foods, further mirroring the diet of a dying invalid rather than a man in his late 30s. The physical pain was a constant, loud static in the background of his mind, a relentless reminder of the young men in black uniforms who had forced him to his knees in the filth. He required heavy, consistent medication just to manage the daily agony in his joints and abdomen, rendering him weak, lethargic, and entirely dependent on the care of others. The SS had succeeded in their darkest, most fundamental goal. They had transformed a proud, active adversary into a physically broken dependent, neutralizing him as a political threat, not through execution, but through the systematic destruction of his biological autonomy. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in blood and fire in the spring of 1945, the victory for Ernst von Hohenberg was entirely hollow. He had outlived the 1,000-year Reich. He had outlived Adolf Hitler, the man whose personal obsessive hatred for the Habsburgs had authored his suffering. He watched as the Nazi regime was dismantled, and the architects of his torture were hunted down, imprisoned, or executed. But the fall of his enemies did not reverse the damage they had inflicted. The end of the war did not magically restore his shredded intestines, regrow his teeth, or erase the deep localized trauma etched into his heart muscle. In the chaotic, desperate years of post-war reconstruction in Austria, Ernst found himself an exile in a new way. The newly formed Austrian Republic, struggling to emerge from the shadow of Nazi complicity and Soviet occupation, had little interest in the remnants of the Habsburg dynasty. The old aristocracy was politically obsolete, viewed with suspicion or complete indifference by a population entirely focused on finding the next meal and rebuilding bombed-out cities. Ernst was a living ghost, a relic of an assassinated empire who had been ground into dust by a defeated dictatorship. He was a man with no political home, possessing only a shattered body and a terrifying set of memories. The final decade of his life was a slow, agonizing descent, a drawn-out epilogue to the murder that had effectively taken place in 1938. He lived a quiet, secluded existence entirely defined by his medical fragility. The physical stamina required to participate in public life, to travel, or to engage in the intellectual pursuits he had once enjoyed was completely gone. The heart, which had been forced to pump blood through a starving, freezing, heavily infected body while enduring the brutal manual labor of the waste carts, was fundamentally compromised. It had been overtaxed beyond its biological limits. Medical science in the late 1940s and early 1950s offered no solutions for the complex, cascading organ failure initiated by years of concentration camp starvation and targeted biological exposure. Every day was a careful, calculated effort to avoid exacerbating his symptoms, a miserable existence of dietary restrictions, pain management, and exhaustion. The poison of the Dachau latrines was patient. It had embedded itself in his tissue, waiting for the inevitable moment when his weakened systems would finally collapse. When death finally arrived on March 5, 1954, it was neither sudden nor unexpected. Ernst von Hohenberg was only 49 years old, an age when a man of his background should have been entering his prime years of influence and stability. Instead, he died in a hospital bed, his body simply giving up the exhausted fight against the damage inflicted a decade and a half earlier. The official medical records listed the cause of death as heart failure. It was a sterile clinical term that completely obscured the horrific truth of his demise. His heart did not simply fail, it was systematically destroyed. It was broken by the freezing Bavarian winters, by the desperate hauling of the Cloak and Karen, by the relentless, humiliating violence of the SS guards, and by the sheer, unmitigated horror of being forced to scrub human excrement with bare hands. Adolf Hitler's vengeance had been executed with terrifying perfection. He did not need to order a firing squad to kill the son of the man who started the First World War. He simply needed to strip him of his humanity, submerge him in disease, and let the cruel, irreversible mathematics of biological decay do the rest. The prince had survived the camp, but he could never survive the latrines. The aftermath of Ernst von Hohenberg's passing was devoid of the grand, sweeping pageantry that usually accompanied the death of a Habsburg. For centuries, the emperors and archdukes of his bloodline had been laid to rest in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, their hearts separated and placed in silver urns, their bodies entombed in massive, ornate bronze sarcophagi surrounded by the weeping nobility of Europe. Ernst's funeral, by stark contrast, was a quiet, private affair. He was buried at Archstetten Castle, the very estate where his parents, the assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, had been interred 40 years earlier because Sophie's non-royal blood had disqualified her from the imperial crypt. The historical symmetry was as brutal as it was absolute. Ernst was returned to the earth not as a ruling monarch of a sprawling empire, but as the exhausted, physically ruined casualty of a political vendetta that had completely redrawn the map of the modern world. The world barely paused to notice his passing. The Cold War was solidifying its grip on Europe, and the tragedy of a single, disenfranchised prince was easily swallowed by the monumental, continent-wide trauma of the Holocaust and the devastating aftermath of the Second World War. To fully grasp the magnitude of what the Nazi regime accomplished with the Hohenberg brothers, we must look at the parallel survival of Maximilian. Ernst's older brother had endured the exact same horrors at Dachau. He had been subjected to the same freezing temperatures, the same brutal beatings, and the identical soul-crushing labor of the Cloaken Commando. Maximilian also managed to survive the camp system, eventually being released and surviving the war. He lived until 1962, outliving Ernst by 8 years. But like his younger brother, Maximilian's survival was merely biological. Those who knew him in the post-war years described a man profoundly altered by his experiences. The gregarious, confident aristocrat of the 1930s had been entirely erased, replaced by a quiet, intensely private man who carried the invisible weight of the latrine trenches in every room he entered. The brothers rarely spoke publicly about the specific agonizing details of their imprisonment. This silence was not born of shame, but of a profound, inaccessible trauma. How does one accurately articulate the experience of being stripped of all human dignity and forced to clear liquid excrement with bare hands to an outside world that has never known such calculated depravity? They carried the reality of Dachau as an isolating shared secret, an invisible boundary separating them from everyone else who had not stood in those specific overflowing pits. This silence contributed to a strange historical amnesia surrounding their specific ordeal. When we study the vast mechanized slaughter of the concentration camp system today, the focus rightfully falls on the millions of men, women, and children who were systematically murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The sheer scale of the genocide often obscures the targeted, highly personalized psychological torture that defined the early years of the camp system at Dachau. The story of Ernst von Hohenberg is frequently relegated to a mere historical footnote, a bizarre piece of trivia about a royal encountering the Nazis. But dismissing his experience as a minor anomaly is a profound mistake. The intentional degradation of the Hohenberg brothers serves as a perfect microscopic distillation of the entire Nazi ethos. It reveals the absolute core of Adolf Hitler's political philosophy, the desire not simply to defeat enemies, but to fundamentally rewrite the hierarchy of human value through the application of unlimited physical force and manufactured disgust. If we travel to the Dachau concentration camp memorial site today, the physical landscape offers a chilling testament to this philosophy. The original wooden barracks have long since rotted away or been demolished, replaced by gravel outlines that mark where thousands of men suffered and died. The massive roll call square remains a vast, empty expanse of concrete that still seems to echo with the bark of SS commands. And while the original open latrine trenches where Ernst was forced to kneel have been filled in and sanitized for modern visitors, the geographical space they occupied remains heavy with the memory of what transpired there. Standing on that ground, one is forced to confront the extreme limits of human cruelty. The Nazis understood that true destruction requires more than just the cessation of a heartbeat. True destruction requires the total dismantling of a person's identity, the severing of their connection to their own past, and the forced realization that their physical body is nothing more than vulnerable, easily corrupted meat. The latrines were the perfect instrument for this dark alchemy. Yet when we examine the final ledger of this horrific conflict, we must ask if Hitler actually achieved his ultimate goal. Did the Führer succeed in transforming the prince into the animal he desperately wanted him to be? The undeniable physical evidence points to a tragic victory for the Nazis. They successfully ruined Ernst's health. They destroyed his digestive system, shattered his teeth, and weakened his heart until it finally stopped beating decades before its time. They robbed him of his physical prime, his political voice, and his right to exist as a healthy, autonomous human being. They proved with terrifying efficiency that royal blood offers absolutely no immunity against a wooden club, freezing temperatures, or the virulent bacteria of a feces-filled trench. In the purely biological arena, totalitarianism won an absolute crushing victory over the fragile human form. But physical destruction is only half the equation. The psychological battle, the silent war fought daily over the cloak and cairn and along the edges of the freezing pits, yielded a vastly different outcome. Every time Ernst von Hohenberg was thrown to the ground by an SS guard, every time he was mocked as the Prince of Shit, the regime demanded a specific reaction. They demanded that he internalize their hatred. They wanted him to look at his permanently stained, bleeding hands and agree with his captors that he was indeed subhuman dirt. But Ernst refused to provide this final validating concession. Through his stubborn, quiet resilience, his refusal to turn violently against his fellow inmates, and his insistence on maintaining an upright, dignified demeanor in the absolute depths of human squalor, he actively sabotaged the core mechanism of his own torture. He endured the filth without allowing it to penetrate his moral center. This is the ultimate enduring legacy of Ernst von Hohenberg. He stands as a stark historical reminder that while a fascist state possesses the mechanical capability to crush the human body, it cannot automatically dictate the condition of the human spirit. The guards at Dachau could force his hands into the waist, but they could not force his mind to accept the subjugation. He died a casualty of the camp, his life significantly shortened by the agonizing physical toll of his imprisonment, but he did not die broken. He took the worst, most personalized humiliation the Third Reich could manufacture, absorbed its lethal biological consequences, and still walked out the other side, refusing to be the terrified, shattered victim they demanded. In the grand, tragic sweep of 20th century history, the image of the prince scrubbing the latrine remains one of the most potent symbols of totalitarian cruelty, but it also endures as a quiet, definitive monument to the indestructible nature of inner human dignity. But the vengeance of the Third Reich was never limited to just one dynasty. Adolf Hitler's paranoia and his deeply ingrained hatred for the old aristocratic order meant that the Habsburgs were not the only royal family to find themselves caught in the merciless gears of the concentration camp system. There was another prominent prince, hailing from one of the most distinguished and ancient noble houses in Germany, who also became the specific target of the Führer's personal wrath. Like Ernst, he was stripped of his titles, ripped from his family, and thrown into the dark, suffocating nightmare of the